It's one thing for a person to disappear. It's another when an entire 70-ton armored tank and a U.S. Army officer vanish, without leaving a single trace behind. In the fall of 2012, the U.S. military was confronted with a mystery it could never publicly explain. A decorated officer, Captain Evan Marshall, vanished during a routine equipment relocation from Fort Ainsworth, a remote testing facility in Nevada. His destination was only 40 miles away. He radioed in, logged his departure, and drove off into the barren stretch of desert that separated the base from the testing grounds. He was never seen again. Months later, hikers stumbled upon a shocking discovery: a rusted armored tank, half submerged near the dark shoreline of Crescent Lake, a body of water far from his assigned route. The vehicle was heavily corroded, its hull scraped by jagged rocks. Inside, the controls were intact. The fuel line hadn't ruptured. The ignition was off. But there was no trace of Captain Marshall. No uniform. No personal belongings. No signs of a struggle. Just the tank, quiet, lifeless, and unervingly clean inside, as if whoever had been there simply walked away. Military officials classified the event as anomalous equipment recovery. No public statement was ever made. But within the walls of Fort Ainsworth, the story spread fast. Soldiers whispered about it in the mess hall, about the man who vanished with his machine, and how, even after the tank was found, his digital records had begun to disappear too. His service file, training history, and even internal logs from the day of the disappearance were mysteriously redacted within weeks. To this day, no one knows who ordered the deletions. And for those who served with him, the unanswered question remains. How does a U.S. Army officer, trained to survive, simply vanish while driving a 70-ton tank, and months later, have that tank reappear somewhere it was never meant to be? This is the story of Captain Evan Marshall, the U.S. Army officer who disappeared in 2012 while driving an armored tank, only for it to be found resting on dark rocks near a body of water. What follows is a chilling journey into a case the military quietly buried, and one that may never have a logical explanation. On the morning of September 8, 2012, the wind rolled lazily across the empty stretch of desert outside Fort Ainsworth, carrying with it the faint metallic hum of heavy machinery. The base sat miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by low hills and the kind of silence that could make even the most disciplined soldier uneasy. To those stationed there, Fort Ainsworth wasn't glamorous. It was a testing site, used mostly for experimental vehicle trials, field training, and classified logistics work. The kind of place that didn't appear on civilian maps. At precisely 8:32 a.m., Captain Evan Marshall, a 34-year-old Armored Division officer, signed his name onto the Daily Transport Manifest. His task: deliver an M1A2 Abrams tank to the southern testing grounds, roughly 40 miles away. The mission was expected to take no more than 4 hours, including offload and return. It was a simple assignment: no live rounds, no escort, no expected interference. A straight drive across familiar terrain. At least, that's how it was supposed to be. Evan Marshall had always been meticulous. His fellow soldiers described him as a man of few words but precise habits. He checked every latch twice, verified every document before signing, and made sure his vehicle was spotless before rolling out. He wasn't the kind of officer to make mistakes or take unnecessary risks. But in the weeks before his disappearance, something in his behavior had changed. His colleagues noticed he'd grown distant. He spent long hours alone in the vehicle bay after dark, sitting inside the tank long after the day's work had ended. When a mechanic once asked if everything was all right, Marshall replied, without looking up, "Some of these things still carry echoes, you know? You can feel them." No one quite understood what he meant. At 8:47 a.m., Marshall radioed the gate tower, confirming his route: Tank 493, DF en route, southbound via convoy path. Security footage caught the tank rolling through the southern checkpoint. He waved at the guard as the heavy metal doors opened, and within seconds, the vehicle disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind a cloud of pale desert dust. That was the last time anyone ever saw him. By noon, dispatch had not received any status update. Normally, this wouldn't raise concern. Communication dead zones were common across that part of Nevada. But by 1:15 p.m., when his GPS tracker also failed to ping, the command center initiated a standard search protocol alpha. 3 Humvees were deployed along the assigned route. By 4 p.m., they returned, empty-handed. No tank tracks, no signs of detour or distress, no debris. Nothing. The following morning, a helicopter search was launched, expanding the radius to 50 miles. Thermal scans showed no metallic heat signatures matching the Abrams. Even more puzzling, the vehicle's onboard transponder, which was designed to transmit independently from GPS, was offline. The system had been manually deactivated. The next day, Colonel Michael Havers, Fort Ainsworth's commanding officer, received a call from the Army Criminal Investigation Division, CID. A small team arrived by nightfall to take over. They interviewed the soldiers who'd interacted with Marshall that morning. Most of them described him as quiet, focused, normal. No one noticed anything unusual in his demeanor. But one soldier, Private Eric Dorsey, mentioned something strange. He said he saw Marshall at 6 a.m., 2 hours before departure, standing beside the tank with his helmet off, staring toward the desert ridge. When asked what he was doing, Marshall simply said, "I want to take this route before they change it again." Dorsey didn't know what that meant, but he remembered the tone, flat, emotionless, almost resigned. Investigators searched Marshall's quarters. His room was immaculate, everything folded, organized, and labeled. The only personal item out of place was an old photo of his late wife, Laura, positioned on his desk beside a small notebook. The notebook contained maintenance logs, handwritten codes, and one peculiar entry dated September 7, 2012, the day before the mission. It read, "If it happens again, record everything. The signal stops near the basin. South Ridge, crescent pattern confirmed." There was no explanation for what that meant. By the end of the first week, search teams had scoured every inch of the mapped route. They extended their search farther south, beyond the official testing grounds. Drones were flown over the Crescent Range, and satellite imaging was requested from the Department of Defense. But the timing couldn't have been worse. A massive dust storm had swept across the region the very afternoon Marshall disappeared. The storm reduced visibility and rendered aerial footage nearly useless. Entire stretches of desert terrain were obscured, some of them for weeks afterward. It was as if the desert itself had conspired to hide the evidence. After 15 days, the case went from a recovery mission to an internal investigation. The Army temporarily classified the disappearance as equipment loss, pending determination. Behind closed doors, however, Fort Ainsworth was in chaos. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed Marshall had intentionally gone AWOL. Others whispered about sabotage, espionage, or even secret testing gone wrong. But those who had worked closely with him refused to believe he would have abandoned his post. "He wasn't that kind of man," one officer later said. "He'd rather die than go rogue." And maybe he did. In late October, CID investigators returned to re-examine Marshall's digital activity logs. That's when they found something curious. 2 days before his disappearance, he had accessed a restricted folder on the base's network titled Project Nighthold. The file was old, archived from 1998 and locked under classified clearance. When investigators attempted to open it, they discovered it had been deleted, completely wiped from the system. Not just hidden, but purged. Only one metadata trace remained, a timestamp reading Crescent Basin, Phase 3 Test Range. That name would become critical months later. By November, official searches were halted. The incident was quietly sealed under classified protocol, and all personnel were instructed not to discuss it outside command channels. But the whispers never stopped. Local residents from nearby towns began reporting strange occurrences, unexplained engine noises echoing at night, faint metallic vibrations from beneath the desert ground, and, on one occasion, what appeared to be deep tank tracks leading toward a restricted zone near a dried lake bed, only to vanish halfway across the sand. No official report acknowledged these claims, but several were logged privately by soldiers. Then, in March 2013, the silence finally broke. A state park ranger patrolling along Crescent Lake, roughly 60 miles south of Fort Ainsworth, radioed a sighting, a large metallic object half-submerged near the northern shore. He initially thought it was construction debris. It wasn't. When Army recovery teams arrived the next morning, they found the missing M1A2 Abrams, the very tank Captain Marshall had been driving. The vehicle was intact. The paint was stripped by weather, the serial numbers barely visible. It was resting on dark volcanic rocks, tilted at an odd angle, like something had gently placed it there. The engine was cold. The ignition was off. And inside, there was no sign of the captain. Not a fingerprint, not a trace of DNA, not even dust where a person should have been. When the armored tank was found resting on the dark volcanic rocks near Crescent Lake, it sent shockwaves through Fort Ainsworth. The discovery came nearly 6 months after Captain Evan Marshall's disappearance. The condition of the vehicle only deepened the mystery. The tank wasn't damaged, burned, or stripped. It looked almost deliberately preserved. The hatches were sealed, the weapon systems disarmed, and the engine completely dead. A thin layer of mineral dust covered its surface, as though it had been sitting there for months, untouched, unmoved, and unnoticed. Investigators from both the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division and Department of Defense arrived within hours. The area was immediately locked down. Civilian access to Crescent Lake was restricted, and military drones circled the site continuously for the next 48 hours. The public was told nothing. According to internal reports later obtained through a leaked memorandum, what investigators found inside the tank was inconsistent with environmental expectations. In other words, what they found didn't make sense. There were no fingerprints, not even Marshall's. No signs of biological residue, no trace of human oil, sweat, or hair. The air inside the cabin was unnaturally stale, almost sterile, despite being sealed for months in open desert heat. But the most baffling detail was the odometer. It showed only 42.3 miles traveled. Marshall's destination had been nearly 40 miles south, but Crescent Lake was over 60 miles from his departure point. Somehow, the tank had traveled much farther than it should have, yet the internal systems suggested it barely moved at all. Military engineers were ordered to transport the tank back to the base under strict surveillance. But even that process was surrounded by strange occurrences. During the lift, several transport specialists reported temporary malfunctions in their communication equipment. Radios went static. GPS devices froze. Even the magnetic compasses spun erratically whenever brought within 20 feet of the vehicle. Technicians later claimed these effects vanished once the tank was placed on the flatbed for removal. It was as if something surrounding the machine resisted interference, but only while it remained near the lake. When the tank arrived at Fort Ainsworth, investigators performed a full teardown. Every component, the fuel cells, transmission, guidance systems, and digital modules, was cataloged and analyzed. One engineer noted that the data drive inside the onboard computer had been overwritten, wiped clean. The only recoverable fragment of information was a short text file, buried deep in the system logs. It contained just 3 words: Crescent complete. Silence. Around the same time, the Army began to quietly reassign personnel who had been directly involved in the initial investigation. Several officers who'd worked closely with Captain Marshall were transferred to unrelated posts without explanation. One sergeant later said off record that they were instructed not to speculate on classified logistics failures. Another soldier claimed his clearance access was revoked the moment he mentioned the incident to family. The phrase "Crescent Complete" quickly became a kind of ghost term on base, whispered in passing, always followed by silence. Meanwhile, residents of nearby Henderson County began to share rumors of what they saw in the weeks before the tank's discovery. One fisherman claimed that on certain nights, the air above Crescent Lake hummed like a transformer, and the surface of the water rippled as though disturbed from below. Another witness, a highway worker, said he once saw a faint orange glow coming from the ridge near the lake. At first, he thought it was campfire light. When he drove closer, it vanished completely, leaving the rocks cold to the touch. Locals said the lake had long been avoided, even before Marshall's disappearance. They spoke of iron noises echoing from the hills after dark, as if something mechanical shifted beneath the ground. None of these reports ever made it into the official record. By May 2013, the Army's Public Affairs Office issued a short statement. A missing armored vehicle has been recovered in Nevada. No evidence of foul play or mechanical failure has been confirmed. The incident remains under review. That was all they said. No mention of the missing officer. No explanation of the tank's condition. The statement was quickly buried under unrelated defense news. But behind closed doors, internal analysis continued. The Defense Department contracted 2 private firms specializing in electromagnetic field anomalies and signal interference. Their findings were never made public, though a summary note in one classified addendum read, "Observed radiation and polarity readings around recovered vehicle inconsistent with natural magnetic signatures." In simple terms, the tank had been exposed to something artificial, something that didn't match any known environmental pattern. By late summer, most of the military's search operations were quietly shut down. Captain Evan Marshall was officially declared missing, presumed dead. His name was added to the Army's internal casualty registry. His family, what remained of it, received a folded flag and a letter of condolence. Yet, privately, several officers who'd known him refused to believe he was dead. One of them, Lieutenant Robert Keyes, later said, "Evan wasn't reckless. He was a by-the-book soldier. Whatever happened out there, it wasn't his doing." In 2014, almost a year later, one final development emerged. A geophysical survey team contracted to study the Crescent Basin region, entirely unrelated to the military, reported abnormal subterranean readings near the area where the tank had been discovered. Their instruments detected a dense metallic object buried approximately 200 feet below the surface, directly beneath the original recovery site. When the data was shared with federal agencies, the site was quickly reclassified as restricted land. The survey team was told to cease all exploration. The following month, new fencing appeared around Crescent Lake. Warning signs were installed, reading, "U.S. government property, no trespassing, hazardous material risk." Locals say that at night, they sometimes still hear distant mechanical sounds coming from that area. Faint, rhythmic, and metallic, like something deep underground, still moving. After the discovery of the tank, Fort Ainsworth began to change. The air on base grew tense, guarded, the kind of silence that doesn't come from discipline but from fear. The soldiers who once discussed the case freely now avoided it completely. Even mentioning Captain Evan Marshall's name in passing seemed to draw unwanted attention. Within weeks of the recovery, CID command ordered that all documentation regarding the missing tank be transferred to a classified network vault under a new label, Crescent Incident, Level 4 Restricted. The physical copies were removed from Fort Ainsworth's archives. That's when the digital deletions began. Military IT specialists later admitted off record that something strange was happening inside their secure systems. Entire data blocks tied to the Crescent case were vanishing from encrypted drives, not through external hacking, but through authorized deletion protocols executed remotely. Every digital trace of Marshall's mission, radio logs, maintenance reports, even his psychological evaluations, was wiped. It was as though the Army wanted to erase not just the evidence, but the very memory of his existence. When a system engineer tried to trace who authorized the deletions, the name field came up blank. The command had no source, no key, and no timestamp. The erasures didn't just come from one place. They came from inside the network itself. By 2014, whispers started spreading beyond military circles. A few independent journalists, mostly veterans with connections to defense insiders, caught wind of a missing tank and classified recovery in Nevada. One of them, a reporter named Daniel Reeves, filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all records tied to Fort Ainsworth's 2012 vehicle losses. His request was denied within 48 hours, a record speed for such filings. Days later, Reeves received an unmarked envelope at his office. Inside were 2 printed pages, no sender, no return address. The first was a redacted transmission log dated September 8, 2012. The second was a blurred black and white photo of the Crescent Basin taken from above. Written in pen across the top margin were 4 words: Phase 3 never ended. Reeves published a short online article describing what little he had, a brief summary of the disappearance, the recovery, and the denial of records. The post went live for just under an hour before his website experienced a sudden server failure. When it came back online, the article was gone. His backup copies were corrupted. And shortly after, Reeves received an email from an anonymous military domain reading only, "Leave Crescent alone." He did. Inside Fort Ainsworth, meanwhile, those still stationed there reported increasing anomalies around the recovered tank. It had been stored in an underground hangar, sealed behind reinforced glass. Security footage from that room revealed subtle movements inside the vehicle, shifts in shadow, faint flickers of light on the interior paneling, even soft static interference across the camera feeds. At first, technicians blamed equipment failure. But one engineer swore he saw the turret turn, just slightly, even though the hydraulics had been removed. The footage from that night was never recovered. In June 2014, the Defense Department decommissioned Fort Ainsworth. The base was closed under the pretense of infrastructure degradation and environmental hazards. Personnel were reassigned, and the entire facility was sealed. But before the last unit departed, a few soldiers took photos of the emptied compound. In one of those photos, taken by an unnamed private, a set of strange markings can be seen carved into the concrete wall near the hangar entrance. 3 crescent shapes, perfectly symmetrical, aligned in a downward arc. To this day, no one knows who made them. Around that same time, a data leak appeared briefly on a dark web archive titled Project Nighthold/Phase 3. The files were heavily encrypted, and most of them unreadable. But one document, decrypted by amateur analysts before it vanished, described a test conducted in 1998. The report referenced experimental magnetic field propulsion and the attempted stabilization of localized spatial displacement. The project supposedly involved unmanned vehicles, not manned tanks. At the bottom of the document was a note, stamped Defense Advanced Research Initiatives Division. And beneath that, a handwritten line. Initial field test located at Crescent Basin, Nevada. The implications were chilling. If true, it meant the same location where Captain Marshall vanished had been used years earlier for an unpublicized experiment involving energy fields and vehicle testing. But there was a deeper question. Why was an active duty officer sent on a routine transport route through a zone that had once hosted experimental weapons research? No official map ever marked Crescent Basin as part of any testing ground. Yet, internal communications recovered from a later whistleblower confirmed that the Army Corps of Engineers had maintained underground access tunnels in that region, tunnels not listed in public defense registries. The cover-up began to take shape. In late 2015, an independent documentary team attempted to visit Crescent Lake after learning of the incident through leaked defense memos. They never made it to the site. Their GPS systems began malfunctioning once they passed the Henderson perimeter. When they stopped their vehicle to recalibrate, they noticed their compass needles spinning aimlessly. Within minutes, their camera batteries died, all at once. They turned back. The footage from that trip was mostly blank static. But in the final frame, just before the tape ended, there was a faint low-frequency hum audible for 2 seconds, similar to the deep mechanical vibration that residents once described. Then silence. By 2016, Crescent Basin had become a no-fly zone. Satellite imaging over the area was censored or replaced with low-resolution data. The land was fenced off, patrolled by unmarked vehicles, and officially listed under U.S. Environmental Containment Operations. No one knew what was being contained. The file name, Project Nighthold, was never mentioned again in any Defense Department budget or record. It was as though the operation, and Captain Evan Marshall's disappearance, had been folded into some larger black project, one that never publicly existed. In the end, all that remained was speculation and fragments. A wiped logbook entry. A tank that moved farther than it should have. An officer who spoke of echoes before he vanished. And a quiet, unmarked stretch of desert that the government still refuses to acknowledge. Somewhere beneath those volcanic rocks, beyond the dark waters of Crescent Lake, something still hums faintly at night, something that wasn't supposed to exist. And maybe, just maybe, that's where Captain Marshall's final transmission still lingers, waiting to be heard. In early 2017, almost 5 years after Captain Evan Marshall disappeared, a small team of analysts working within the Defense Communications Retention Bureau, DCRB, stumbled upon a fragmented data packet during a routine server audit. The packet was part of a corrupted archive scheduled for deletion, a set of low-frequency emergency transmissions recorded in September 2012, the same week Marshall vanished. The message was brief, broken, and nearly inaudible. But through digital reconstruction, a few words emerged from the static. 493, DF, visual confirmed, signal, repeating, no, turning. The call sign, 493, DF, matched the serial number of Marshall's tank. The discovery was not publicly acknowledged. The file was quietly relabeled as training signal error, non-critical, yet multiple technicians involved in its recovery later confirmed that the metadata proved otherwise. The transmission wasn't a drill log. It came from a live field transponder, broadcast approximately 45 miles south of Fort Ainsworth, almost exactly where the tank should have been before it vanished. And more unsettlingly, the timestamp showed it had been sent 9 hours after Marshall's last known radio contact. That meant, for at least part of that day, someone, or something, had been operating the tank. The DCRB attempted to trace the transmission source. But every analysis led to an identical error, signal origin indeterminate, frequency overlap detected. In plain terms, the data suggested that 2 identical sources had transmitted the same message simultaneously from slightly different coordinates. It was as if there had been 2 transmitters, both broadcasting the same distress call, one from near Crescent Basin, and one from inside Fort Ainsworth itself. When the anomaly reached upper command, the entire audit project was abruptly shut down. The technicians were reassigned, and the DCRB database was scrubbed. But one of those technicians, later identified only as RL in leaked documents, made a personal copy of the audio fragment before it was deleted. Months later, it surfaced online under the name The Forgotten Transmission. The recording was less than 12 seconds long. It began with a crackling hum, followed by a male voice distorted by interference. Crescent, can you read? It's cold, repeating pattern, signal stops, moving. Then silence. A faint mechanical tone pulsed 3 times, followed by a sharp drop in frequency. Many who heard it dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, the kind of viral mystery easily manufactured by digital artists. But others noted that the distortion pattern matched military encrypted transmission formats used at Fort Ainsworth in 2012. Even the voice, when run through digital enhancement, appeared consistent with Captain Marshall's speech patterns recorded in his archived radio checks. If the reconstruction was authentic, it meant the captain had transmitted something from the field, possibly from inside the tank, long after official logs marked him missing. The leaked recording was swiftly taken down. Government IPs flagged the content and issued copyright claims citing federal proprietary material. But the damage was done. Copies had already spread across private message boards, shared between amateur signal analysts, veterans, and conspiracy researchers. Theories began to multiply. Some believed the signal was proof that Marshall had driven into an undisclosed military test zone, one linked to the Nighthold project. Others claimed he'd encountered a classified energy experiment that folded the tank into a distorted electromagnetic field, a kind of invisible barrier that scrambled space and time. More skeptical voices argued that the recording could have been the result of delayed radio wave refraction, a real phenomenon where old signals bounce between layers of the atmosphere and return years later. But that theory fell apart when experts pointed out that such signals would degrade far beyond recognition. The Crescent transmission, however, was oddly intact, as if preserved within a closed system. It hadn't echoed back from the sky. It had been waiting, somewhere, until someone found it. In 2018, a small group of civilian researchers, calling themselves the ECHO Project, began reanalyzing declassified atmospheric data from Nevada. Using open-source satellite telemetry, they noticed faint, recurring electromagnetic spikes around the Crescent Basin area. The readings appeared irregular but constant, repeating every 36 hours with minor fluctuations. The amplitude of the waves was low, but their pattern matched the pulse intervals found in the forgotten transmission's background hum. When plotted on a map, the signal's path formed a crescent shape, almost identical to the one carved into the hangar wall at Fort Ainsworth. Coincidence, perhaps. But to those who'd followed the case for years, it was another reminder that the silence surrounding Captain Marshall wasn't just bureaucratic, it was deliberate. In late 2019, the ECHO Project team submitted their findings to the Department of Energy, asking whether any known installations could explain the interference pattern. 2 weeks later, they received an official response. The reply contained no technical explanation. It simply read, "Your inquiry pertains to restricted defense infrastructure. Cease analysis immediately." Shortly after, the project's public website went offline. By 2020, the Crescent story had become a modern military legend, dismissed by officials, feared by insiders, and obsessed over by online communities. Some claimed the government was still conducting energy field experiments in that region, using Crescent Basin as a controlled site for propulsion research. Others speculated that the tank itself was still operational, locked away in a classified hangar, monitored for unexplained power readings. But the one thing that no one could explain was the continuing pulse detected near the lake. Even independent amateur radio operators, using simple ground antennas, reported faint rhythmic hums near the 12 MHz band, the same frequency range as the lost transmission. Each time they captured it, the sequence repeated the same pattern. 3 short pulses. 1 long. Silence. Then again, 3 short. It never changed. In the years since, Crescent Basin has remained sealed under federal restriction. Satellite imagery still shows nothing but dark rock and shallow water, no facilities, no visible structures. Yet residents from surrounding towns continue to report strange occurrences. Unmarked vehicles parked along the highway at night. Low vibrations rumbling through the earth. And once, a faint beam of light that seemed to rise straight from the lake before fading into the clouds. To most, these are nothing more than myths, the byproduct of isolation and fear. But to those who remember Captain Evan Marshall, they are reminders of a truth buried beneath the official reports. Somewhere, under the layers of secrecy, something is still transmitting, still calling out from a forgotten machine that should not be alive. And though no one dares to investigate anymore, a quiet question lingers among those who once served with him. If the transmission is still repeating, who, or what, is sending it now? In 2022, Nearly a decade after Captain Evan Marshall vanished, a classified maintenance update appeared in an internal Defense Department archive under the heading Inactive Equipment Inventory, Crescent Storage. The entry contained one brief note. Unit 493, DF, status, sealed. Internal power fluctuation observed. It was the first acknowledgement of the tank's existence in almost 10 years. The document was digitally time-stamped, reviewed, and then locked under Level 4 clearance within hours. To most analysts, it was just another forgotten file buried in the defense database, but to those who had quietly followed the Crescent case, it was proof. The tank wasn't scrapped, destroyed, or dismantled. It was still somewhere, contained, and something inside it was still active. A former contractor, speaking under anonymity in 2023, described what he claimed was a containment bay located 200 miles north of Henderson County, a subterranean facility that stored classified propulsion vehicles. He said one of the bays was marked 493 DF, the same identifier assigned to Marshall's Abrams. When asked what condition it was in, he replied, "It wasn't rusting. It wasn't dead. It looked preserved, like it was waiting for something." The panel lights would flicker even when the power grid was disconnected. The contractor's claim couldn't be verified, but 2 months later, his professional records disappeared from public defense databases. His contracting company's registration was revoked. He was never heard from again. Around that same time, a defense cybersecurity group monitoring unauthorized transmissions picked up an unusual frequency near Tonopah, roughly 180 miles from Crescent Basin. The signal pattern matched the old Crescent pulses, 3 short, 1 long, but this time there was a faint modulation embedded in the background. When amplified, it revealed fragments of human speech. Broken, distorted, but recognizable. If it happens again, record everything. The signal stops, near the basin. The words were identical to those found in Captain Marshall's handwritten notebook from 2012. Either someone had replicated his message exactly, or the same signal that vanished a decade earlier was somehow transmitting again from a new location. When analysts compared the timestamps from the new signal bursts, they noticed something chilling. Each transmission aligned precisely with seismic tremors recorded around the Crescent area. Minor earth shifts that occurred at nearly the same intervals as the electromagnetic spikes first observed by the ECHO project years earlier. It was as if something beneath Crescent Basin was waking up. The Department of Defense never commented, but by mid-2023, Crescent's restricted perimeter expanded dramatically. A new layer of fencing appeared, and locals began reporting low-frequency noises at night, deep, rhythmic sounds that some described as a heartbeat under the earth. Then, in December of that year, an encrypted file surfaced briefly on a cloud server linked to an inactive military test account. It contained what appeared to be part of Captain Marshall's digital logbook, extracted from the tank's onboard computer. Only the final entry was readable. Field check complete. Signal recorded again. Not electromagnetic. Not mechanical. Pattern feels aware. Vehicle temperature drop unnatural. Visual anomaly forming outside hatch. Going to investigate. That was the last line. No signature. No timestamp. Just an abrupt end. Theories exploded across classified and public channels alike. Some said Marshall had stumbled upon a defense experiment that achieved partial spatial displacement, an attempt to manipulate localized fields around armored vehicles. Others claimed the experiment had gone wrong, trapping him between 2 states, physical and electromagnetic. Those who read the final log called it the last entry, and to this day, no official department acknowledges its existence. But those who've analyzed its digital signature say the log's metadata is authentic. Its creation date matches September 8, 2012, at 11:26 a.m., nearly 3 hours after his last confirmed contact. That means he was still alive, still writing, after the Army had already begun searching for him. By early 2024, the story of Captain Marshall had largely faded from public conversation. The few who still searched for answers found their channels demonetized, their pages flagged for sensitive content, and their footage quietly removed. Even some of the old archived documents vanished from the public domain. Yet through it all, one thing has remained constant: the sound. Each year, around September, independent radio operators continue to capture faint signal bursts across the western Nevada desert. The frequency remains unchanged: 3 short pulses, 1 long. Those who've recorded it say that when amplified, you can still hear something faint beneath the static, like the low hum of an idling engine echoing from somewhere far away. Some researchers believe these signals are nothing more than radio interference, remnants of old military frequencies bouncing across the ionosphere. But others, including several retired engineers who worked on the Abrams communication systems, disagree. They claim that each pulse corresponds to the exact energy output needed to trigger a magnetic field reboot within an M1A2 tank system, a signal used to restart an onboard control grid after total shutdown. In other words, someone, or something, might still be trying to turn the tank back on. Today, Crescent Basin remains off-limits. No public aircraft fly over it. No civilian maps detail its terrain. And yet, those who live within miles of it swear the air feels different, thicker, electrically charged, especially at night. One local resident described it best: "It's like the land remembers something it's not supposed to." No one knows what really happened to Captain Evan Marshall. The official record says he was lost in an equipment malfunction during an unauthorized maneuver. But the silence surrounding the Crescent Basin tells another story, one that still pulses faintly through static and sand, buried under the hum of desert wind. Perhaps one day, when the transmission stops repeating, we'll know the truth. Or perhaps it's better that we never do. If you found this story chilling, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. It helps uncover more mysteries like this one. And as always, stay curious, stay alert, and never stop asking questions.